Man, her biography goes for days and days and days, all of her accomplishments. A daughter of the North, Dr. Suzanne Stewart. Masicho, and welcome back.
I'm Suzanne. Most of us in this room know who Canada's Indigenous population are. According to Statistics Canada, there are about 1.1 million Indigenous people. That's about 4% of the population. Currently, about 60% of that population almost lives in urban areas, and every year that number actually grows exponentially. So there's a huge migration demographically of Aboriginal people from rural and remote and reserve communities to urban centers. And that would include urban centers like Yellowknife. When we talk about Aboriginal youth and education, there's much data out there that talks about this dim and dismal picture that we have. And this data is true for the populations it represents. So we know things like 40% of Aboriginal people, young adults, don't have a diploma. That's compared to 13% of non-Aboriginal Canadians. First Nations youth who live on reserves have actually a higher number of non-completion of high school, 61% for First Nations, and even higher in the far north for Inuit, closer to 70%. And these numbers are distressing because we know that without an education, it's very difficult to get a job. And we know what that means when we don't have jobs. We can't feed ourselves, we can't take care of ourselves, we can't move into our futures the way we want to. However, and I talked about this morning, it's very dangerous to think about things like low educational achievement for Aboriginal students when the data that we have is based on what is actually only a percentage of the population. Most Aboriginal students in Canada actually don't live on the reserve, right? We already established that earlier. 60% of the population lives in urban areas, which means they go to schools that are not on a reserve. And in fact, many students who live on reserves don't go to schools on reserves. And many students who live in places like the Northwest Territories aren't subject to band-run schools the way other First Nations are. And that's where all of this data about First Nations high school completion and attrition rates come from. So given this sort of wide range of contexts for where Aboriginal young people go to school, it's really in our best interest as consumers of this knowledge to resist this urge to oversimplify what we know about Aboriginal education. The truth is that most Aboriginal students go to school off reserve, and most of those Aboriginal students finish high school, go on to complete secondary school, or at least they do well in school, but their data is not captured in this information. So we need to really think about that before we start making generalizations about how poorly Aboriginal students do in school. Let's talk about the picture of unemployment in Canada for Aboriginal people, just for a minute. So we know that every year more and more Aboriginal people are moving into cities. They're moving to Yellowknife, they're moving to Edmonton, they're moving to Toronto, they're moving to Saskatchewan or to Saskatoon. Well, in theory, if they're moving into cities, wouldn't we imagine that they would be getting more jobs? The reason most people leave their rural, remote, or reserve communities is in search of jobs, is in search of education that they're not finding in their isolated communities. And that's part of globalization. And we all know about that, and we all know what that means in our communities. But in fact, in 2006, and that was the last census data, the unemployment rate for Aboriginal people was double the national average. For Aboriginal youth specifically, that rate is even higher, so it's 2 to 3 times higher for Aboriginal people than non-Aboriginal people under the age of 24. And what this suggests to me as a researcher, that there are actually barriers that exist for employment for Aboriginal people that aren't just to do about accessing employment or having education, because we already know that people can access employment because they're in cities where there's more jobs, and we already know that Aboriginal people have some levels of education, right? So what is it? Well, one answer can be sort of looked at in this current picture as understanding that current models of career development and career support that students get in high schools and in the community are not really working for Aboriginal youth. Why is that? Because they're not culturally compatible. They don't take into account cultural identity and what that means for employment for young people or for adults from Aboriginal communities. Career counseling programs or career development programs don't usually take into account that culture is a central aspect of Aboriginal people's lives, and that actually affects the jobs people choose, why they choose their work, where they choose their work, how they do their work. And further to that, mainstream employment agencies and support programs don't actually offer any type of career training that takes into account what the cultural influences are on young people. Not just Aboriginal people, but all people. Everyone, I think, in this room would agree that employment is an important part of life. And in my view as a psychologist, you know, I do a lot of things in my work, right? I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, but I also work as a clinician in the Aboriginal community. And when I work every day with people who are depressed, people who are anxious, with people who have personality disorder type traits, most of these people don't work. And when you don't work, you lack that central piece of meaning and purpose in your life. You don't have a reason to get up out of bed. You don't have a reason to feel good about yourself. So work, for me, is about not just making money and contributing to the economy and paying the bills. Work is also about fulfilling that deeper psychological need for self-efficacy, for autonomy, for being able to look after yourself and feel good about yourself, being able to heal from things that harm you.
I have a friend who's really going through a lot right now. She's very depressed and down, and she's on disability. She's been on disability. Yeah. She can't work. She was in a horrible car crash. So she's really down. She calls all the time, and we're doing our best to support her. But you just hit the nail on the head that she hasn't been able to work for over 13 months. So for 13 months, she's just been in her house. She's been in her head. And so she needs to get back to work in whatever way, whether it's volunteering. So I thank you, because we've been trying to do our best. But if you don't get out of your house, you don't get out of your head, what's going to change? So Masi Cho, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I agree with that. That's a great example to illustrate my point. Working is part of overall mental health. Other information that's important is that it's actually well documented in existing research that work experiences can also help us to feel better about ourselves, but they can also promote distress. So depending on if we're satisfied or not satisfied with our work, that predicts and impacts what our mental health is like currently and in the future. What's important about knowing that is understanding that cultural factors actually play a huge role in how we feel about ourselves in work and how we perform in work, thereby impacting our mental health. And that's the piece that hasn't been examined in the literature and hasn't been examined in career supports for people, including Aboriginal people. So let's keep going on this train of thought with. So we know that Indigenous people as a population, that's high. We know violence is high. We know that statistically Aboriginal people are more likely to go to jail than to finish high school. We know that the cause of death due to alcohol is also higher than for non-Aboriginal people. Despite this crisis of mental health problems, there is a perpetual and chronic underuse of mental health services, well documented by Aboriginal people in Canada. And that's mostly because the medical model of mental health services does not work for Indigenous people because it does not focus on spirituality or cultural identity. And what the research says is that most Aboriginal people do not return for counseling, psychiatry, or psychological services after the first visit if the approach taken by the professional is not somewhat adapted to a cultural model of healing. So, therefore, I've given you all the background. Therefore, why do we want to look at the outcomes of education and employment? We're calling those life transitions for youth. Well, I want to look at those from a perspective that is no longer pathologizing our people. I'm tired of research that's saying, this is what's wrong with youth. This is what's wrong with Aboriginal people. This is why they can't finish school. This is why they can't get jobs. I wanted to create a body of work that talked about the strengths and the resources of young people. And I wanted to get that information from young people themselves. So that's what I've done in like 6 projects, but I'm only going to share 2 projects with you. So I'm going to talk about both of these projects. One finished last year, and that was called Stronger Together. And the second project, the work-life identity of Aboriginal youth, is almost done, and that'll be finished next year. The Stronger Together project, that's Stronger Together Youth and Elders Together, is, like all of my research, a partnership-based project that looks at cultural identity awareness and development for youth. And we used traditional knowledges, process, and methodologies in data collection and data analysis. So the research question, which was developed in partnership with our community partner, who is the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto, they wanted to know, they developed this question, how do Aboriginal youth in Toronto understand and relate to their cultural identity? And what community services and supports in the city do Aboriginal youth require for mental health promotion and cultural identity and well-being? So we looked at these questions by using an approach that I developed a number of years ago called sort of Aboriginal narrative methodology. And that brings together traditional Indigenous knowledges as a way of knowing and collecting information and Western narrative inquiry. All of my research really works from a community-driven perspective. We know that there is a tattered and torn history of research in Aboriginal communities. Part of my job as a researcher, because I work in the Western system, there's my brother. I work in the Western system. I feel like it's my responsibility as a researcher to start to repair that relationship. So I do that by creating community-based research and talking about and bringing healing into the process of research itself. Because healing can exist in research when the research is created and carried out and completed to benefit the people that you're doing research with, not to benefit the researcher. But most of you guys already know that. I don't need to talk about that here. So in this project, this was a small project. This is actually designed to be, this project, Stronger Together, is sort of a pilot for a much bigger project, which I applied for last year, but was shortlisted and I'm applying for again through a partnership grant. So we did one focus group and we did a small amount of individual interviews. And the data was analyzed in the focus group by the focus group participants themselves. So the focus group was comprised of Aboriginal youth who were asked these questions that I posted earlier. And then the youth sort of broke the questions into codes and categories and grouped them according to themes. So from this focus group, we came up with 4 meta-themes, the participants did, about what was important to youth and identity and community development, and outcomes related to employment, of course. And the youth felt that things like early influence, education, and community were really important to them as far as what supports that they needed. But when they talked about identity, they talked about identity in 2 ways. They talked about their identity within mainstream culture, and then they talked about their identity within the Indigenous community. And they saw these as 2 really different experiences. So when they talked about community as being important to understanding who they were and what they could do with their lives, what they were really talking about is needing to access Indigenous knowledge as a part of education to help them feel good about themselves. That's what they said made them feel good about who they were. Many Aboriginal youth said that they also had a negative association with their traditional culture, and many youth that they knew had dismissed their culture. And many youth are actually sometimes not interested in participating in their culture because of these bad experiences that they've had. If youth were not involved in their community, per se, they felt like it was very difficult to access any information about culture, identity, or language. So if they didn't feel safe in the Aboriginal community, they had no way to access traditional knowledge. Youth also felt that when they were active in their community, it provided opportunities for leadership for them, and that it was a positive thing. When they talked about early influences, youth felt that early childhood experiences, particularly with family and community, both positive and negative experiences, really had a strong impact on how they later developed their connection to culture and identity. That's obvious, I guess, but when you hear it from youth, it seems much, much more important. Youth overwhelmingly agreed that mainstream education was not sensitive to Indigenous ways of knowing or Indigenous knowledges, and they felt like the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum would help them get a better sense of understanding of who they were and feel like they belonged in the education system, which many young people felt like they didn't do. And they also felt like they needed to hear history from an Aboriginal perspective, which they currently were not getting within the school system. When youth talked about their identity within mainstream culture, a lot of youth feel that they have internalized negative stereotypes. Aboriginal youth who resist these negative stereotypes are youth who have identified themselves as reconnecting with their traditions, their cultures, and feeling like being part of their families and their communities who were strong in their culture is what was key for them in being able to do that. So I think that's good if you have a family who does that, but if you have a family who doesn't, that probably leaves most youth to be in the other category where they're internalizing negative stereotypes because they don't have access to the positive reinforcement in their family. Don't worry, you'll have time for questions after. I'm kind of trying to race through this because I have a lot of information. So we also got some results from the individual interviews, and these were around overarching themes of community, again, the same as in the focus group, traditional involvement, peers, identity, and racism as the important things to the lives of youth. One youth in an interview said, "We can all come together and be a community based on commonalities. Speaking for me and my friends, we all come from somewhere else and we are strong in our identities and where we come from. We can all get along and joke around and make fun. And at the end of the day, we know that there are differences too. So this young person was talking about how important it was to be involved in community, because community brings people together, even if they're different or even if they're the same. But the important piece is that coming together. So she was really speaking to the diversity and the strength that is in the diversity of an Aboriginal community. When people talked about peers, So we did a focus group with the people who worked with youth, and then we did 20 interviews with Aboriginal youth themselves, asking the same questions. And I don't know why the questions aren't up here, because I was probably tired when I did the PowerPoint, but the questions centered around things like, what are your past, present experiences in the workplace? How do you feel like those could be improved in the future? Have you ever experienced any barriers in work? If so, what were they? What do you feel like the strengths you have as employers? And what do you feel like the strengths are of Aboriginal youth in working in Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal environments? Those are the questions that we asked. So the results that came from these interviews, and this is probably what people are most interested in, are that there's a big issue with cultural respect in the workplace. Cultural identity in the workplace is probably the biggest issue for youth, and around that, youth continue to feel, as do the employers, that racism and oppression are the biggest problem in finding and keeping work, and that the one thing that helps them keep work the most is being inspired by other young people who do well. So basically, when we talk about the need for cultural respect in the workplace, what they were saying, the employers were saying, and the youth, is that sort of traditional Western human resources didn't really cut the mustard for meeting the needs of Aboriginal employees. There was often a lack of cultural awareness and respect. There was a lack of resources for Aboriginal employees. And employers needed to get education to understand what the strengths are that Aboriginal youth and employees in general bring to the workplace, that those were often overlooked. One person said, youth need to find business opportunities that are culturally sensitive to their needs. And I think that's, pardon me, my throat's dry. I think that's sort of sad that our people have to go out and find jobs that will adapt to them rather than jobs that will adapt to the needs of our people. But we can talk about our opinions about this later. Racism and oppression. Again, this was the big piece of this research, of the outcome. Employers and youth both felt that there needed to be an advocacy and an action plan in place for Aboriginal youth who are working, who are developing their careers. There is misguidance and lack of support by employers, both in the Aboriginal community and outside the Aboriginal community. In the workplace, there is a lot of negativity and oppression and isolation experienced by Aboriginal employees. Systemic oppression remains high and exists at every level. And that when Aboriginal people experience this in the workplace, what happens? They feel defeated. They have low self-esteem. They don't want to go on. So it impacts their mental health. One participant said, some employers don't want to work with Native youth because of preconceived notions of Native people. And I think that says it all. One positive thing that was said was that youth felt that when they worked with other youth who were doing well, so they had role models and mentors, that they were empowered, that successful youth were youth that were able to think and work outside the box. In other words, they were trailblazers. Remember that? Remember I said that this morning? Positive reinforcement came when they worked with other Aboriginal youth. They felt confident, there were more business opportunities, and they felt like the leadership was healthier. Employers need to be positive role models to the youth, and employers need to love Aboriginal youth is what one participant said. So what does all this data, and this is a lot of data, and this is a lot of work getting all this information. What does it mean? Well, I think what it means is that we need to understand that employment is a major factor that can help people emerge from negative experiences in their life, such as poverty. We know that. But further than that, we need to understand that employment continues to be a negative experience for a lot of Aboriginal youth in Canada, particularly in cities. And employment, places of employment, seem to be places where racism and stereotypes continue to be perpetuated, and that this probably needs to stop. That's what I would tell employers. That's what I would tell organizations. And that's what I tell the government when they ask me what I'm doing with my research. What does this research mean for educators? Well, I think it's really important to understand that youth need more opportunities to have more responsibilities earlier on in their careers, even maybe when they're still in school. Because when they do things and they're inspired and they have responsibilities, they feel good about themselves. That's what the youth said. People who are supporting youth in going to school and finding jobs, like these career counselors, they need to understand the history and the needs of Aboriginal people, because those are different than non-Aboriginal people. And I'm not going to go into how it's different, because we all know here, everyone in this room knows how it's different. And I think the really important thing is understanding that racism and oppression need to be addressed at the policy level, as well as the personal level, by educators, because educators are the ones who are turning out all these other people who are perpetuating the stereotypes as employers, as co-workers, right? This needs to change fundamentally at the level of education. That's how racism and oppression stops, when we educate people about the history of Aboriginal people, about the history of colonization, and about understanding what colonization looks like today. For counseling, I'm a counselor, I'm a therapist. That's who I really am at heart. I'm here to help people deal with their problems so that they can move on and meet their goals. And when I think about what this means for counselors, well, what this means is, at a very basic level, is we need to move out of our ethnocentric models of how we do business as professional helpers and start looking to the Indigenous knowledges and what those can offer for helping our youth in meeting their goals. Indigenous knowledges isn't all, magic and smoke and mirrors, as people talked about this morning. Indigenous knowledge is about coming from the spirit. As a psychologist, I understand Indigenous knowledge as something that's deeply intimate and personal, as something that's spiritual and about what you know inside your heart and inside your body, about what you learn from having your feet on the ground, about what you learn from being in relationship with people who are other spiritual people. And that's everyone, because everyone is a spiritual person. What does that look like in practice? Well, we need to create more hybrid models that bring together traditional ways of knowing and Western ways of doing things, because that's what the world looks like now. All Indigenous people around the world, according to the World Health Organization, every Indigenous person internationally comes into contact with the Western world once every day. So it's not practical to say, well, I just want to go back to doing everything the traditional way. Well, how's that going to work when I need to text you on my iPhone? Probably not going to work. How's that going to work when I have to sit in a classroom with 60 students who want to learn how to become psychologists and I need to teach them? It's not going to work, because we have to work with the best of both worlds, and that's what hybridism is, bringing together the best of two different worldviews. And that's from the work of Eduardo Duran, a Pueblo psychologist. whose work has really guided me over the last 7 years since he published that book. The other recommendation is awareness. We need to have awareness about our cultures and about other people's Indigenous cultures, and we need to bring those together because we're all here together. So policy, what do I have to say to the policy people? Well, I think the most important thing I can say to policymakers, and I have the data to back this up, is that we need at the policy level to support more programming that brings together youth and elders who use Indigenous knowledges along all of the spectrum of educational and employment services, not just language courses, not just culture courses. This is what young people want. This is what young people need to do well in their lives. This is what they're saying. We also need to identify and support Aboriginal leaders within Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal governments. We want to resist ghettoizing Aboriginal professionals within culturally specific programs and services. Do you know what I mean when I say this? Do you guys, what do you think of that idea? Don't know what I mean? So let's say I'm an Aboriginal professor working at an institution. I'm over there doing all the Aboriginal stuff, and I have nothing to do with the rest of everything that goes on there. That would be ghettoizing me to work only on Aboriginal issues. Aboriginal issues are all people's issues because we all live in relationship with Aboriginal people. So I think Aboriginal people should be working in all areas of education, of all areas of government, of all areas of the profession in which they're working. Just because you're Aboriginal doesn't mean you should be the Aboriginal person in that department doing all the Aboriginal things. You might be Aboriginal, but do you know every Aboriginal thing? No. If you're an Aboriginal person here and you've been in a class, raise your hand if you've ever been asked to answer questions for all Aboriginal people. More than once? Did any of you ever get up and walk out? I did, because it happens so much. It happens so much in graduate school. Even the professor would look at me. I'd be like, why are you looking at me? I don't know. I don't know what the Mi'kmaq do in the winter. Don't ask me that. I've never even been out to the East Coast. That's just one example. I could give you some horror stories, but you know what? I'm not going to go there now because we're not here for horror stories. We're here for fun and good times, right? We're here to have fun. We're here to laugh. So I'm going to give you the last of the policy recommendations, and we'll really get laughing. So I think the other really big recommendation that I have for policy is that it's time, this is based on my research, this is not just my opinion, but fortunately my opinion aligns with the research, is it's really time to ensure that we do not place non-Aboriginal people in leadership positions within Aboriginal initiatives. Youth talked about having models and mentors who are other Aboriginal youth, who are Aboriginal elders, and what a positive effect it has on their identity development, their self-esteem, and their self-efficacy. But it's also just as demoralizing when an Aboriginal young person comes into a program, into initiative, into something, and they see a non-Aboriginal person in charge of that. What message does that send to them? Racism and stereotypes are still the most prevalent barriers to successful outcomes for young people today in our society. Those are things that we can and need to work on. The influence of family and community of traditional culture has not only a buffering effect, but a healing effect on this and other harms that have been done to our people. So let's keep bringing out our traditional knowledges. Let's keep working with our traditional people, with our elders. Let's keep listening to our heart and our spirit and our bodies and listening to what the young people say. And that's about it. That's all I have to say. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. So do we have any questions for Dr. Stewart?
Thank you for your presentation. It was really, I guess, for me, there was a lot of things there that you said that were food for thought, but there's also other stuff that I challenge, mainly because, maybe I'll give you a history of myself. My name is Joseph Tidlichi. I'm from Whitehorse, originally from Fort McPherson. I went through the residential school. I went through grade 12. I spent 20 years out on the land. I moved into the city, so I consider myself an urban Indian. But also, I have the balance of two worlds. In your presentations this morning and today, this evening, you never mentioned anything about family dynamics and also who has the responsibility. You know, we can talk so much about the negative stuff, statistics, everything like that, all the negative stuff. But we also have to, and you mentioned there the strengths. And if we can focus on the strengths more than we talk about the negative stuff, I think we're on the right track. I think also too that family family dynamics is a real crucial part of success in regards to bringing up youth. We've gone through a lot of oppression, we've gone through a lot of racism, but in my life, I don't choose to go there. I've experienced it, it's behind me, I'm going to leave it behind me. I've gone through residential school, I've gone through intergenerational trauma, but that's behind me. I don't want to put that on my children. There's programs available now where residential school is going to be put into the curriculum. What benefit is that going to do to our youth? Why do we need to show them the trauma that happened on children? So I just want to throw that in because I think it's a really no-no. And personally, you know, I have two boys. I've never talked to them about my school experience because they don't need to know. They have a fresh start. When they were born, they didn't have to go through residential school. So why put that in front of them and say, you know, I went to residential school and all this stuff happened to me. They don't need to know that because they're pure and innocent. And I think we need to focus on that. Family dynamics, very important. Family needs to take responsibility in order for youth to take success. Because we're gonna, as I think family, we have to give them the values and we have to give them the traditional knowledge that's gonna put them on a solid foundation to deal with the situations that come up in life. I really think that's important because maybe because I experienced it and I lived it and I'm trying to break the cycle. I broke the cycle many years ago. 20 years ago, I broke the cycle. And now I can say in a real good way that I think my kids are on the road to success because of the values that I've instilled in them, the values that my wife and I instilled in them. And I think that's important because family has to be a piece of the puzzle. And once you take that responsibility away from the family, that's where we're going wrong, I think, because too many times, and I worked in the communities, quite a bit of communities. I work in the residential school file in Whitehorse. Too many times we give that responsibility to a department or a different group. And I think that's wrong because we take away the responsibility that we have as parents. And my job as an Aboriginal person is to make sure that my children have that balance so that they can go out on the land and they can experience everything that the land has to offer and be successful and be comfortable out there. But also they can come back into modern society. You call it Western society. You can go into modern society and also be successful there. So I just wanted to throw that in. I like your presentation, but it's something in my real job that I'm really concerned about, and I see it so many times. And it's to instill so much good values into the child, because you talk about success. Well, in real life society, what do? We just push our kids right through to grade 12. The system does that to us. So when they reach grade 12 and they graduate, and we all know that, if you give them an exam, a grade 6 exam, they're going to fail it because they're pushed through the system. And I think the reason being is that as family, we're not doing our responsibility. I just want to throw that out. Lots of room for discussion. I could be in left field, but that's just my belief. Merci.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I think you raised some important points there, and I think it's quite true that everyone has their own way of understanding and handling how traumatic experiences have affected them and how they want to handle them within their own family context. I think as a society, Canada has And in humanistic psychology, Western humanistic psychology, we believe that every person is responsible for their own healing. And that's very much what I heard this gentleman talking about. So I'd like to thank him for sharing his story and hope that I address some of those concerns a little bit.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really learned a lot, and I thought it was very important. It's so nice to see that we're moving away from disease models in terms of research that's taking place. I'm just wondering, and maybe disease model is still around, but I just think...
Oh, it is.
It is, alive and well. I'm just wondering, in the next 5 years, is there emerging trends that you think, or gaps in the research now that you're engaged in, and people like yourself who is engaged in, big gaps that they're trying to address? Or I see what you've done with the youth. For instance, I was curious if you had seen big differences, say, between in gender youth, like female or male.
Well, it's interesting that you should bring that up. So one of my graduate students just completed her postdoc on she did her doctorate degree on
Thanks. My name's Rosanna, and I moved here about a year ago. I come from Ottawa. My mom's German, and my dad his family comes from England and Scotland. And I really hear what you're saying, that the education system could use a lot of help, and there's a lot of information that's not passed on. But coming from the first person's question this evening, I also do have concerns about how it's not a very safe space as it is, and so how would you recommend bringing a decolonizing force into our mainstream education system? Like, how would you recommend it becoming a space where people explore their own assumptions and stereotypes? I just wonder if you have some thoughts on how that could happen in the current education system that we have. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all,
I'd work with consultation and with Indian Affairs and to do with mine remediation. And I really enjoyed your talk on the education part of it. The leadership and the elders have always told us to involve youth in our the work we do, in particular the science people that I work with. And so we introduced Introduction to Science. We did that since 2007, and I went into job shadow, where we hire youth to be a part of mine remediation, monitoring, water collections and analysis, metals analysis, and that type. So we're kind of looking at and hoping that we'll be introducing youth to consider science as a career, so that eventually they'll be able to work on their land and to take care of the land, the animals, and the wildlife, and those things. So in looking at your the talk you did, and I enjoyed, and the mentoring part of this, and looking forward, and getting youth, getting past grade 12, going into science, and I'm hoping that you'll maybe look at the mentoring part of this whole process, and looking at science as one of the things that could be something that we try to introduce more of the Aboriginal youth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely.